Hi class, welcome back to Biomedical Ethics. Today we will be moving into the area of experimentation. In particular, we'll be looking at ethical questions that arise in research contexts. This week we'll be focused on ethical questions concerning animal research, and next week we'll be moving into the whole host of questions of ethical concerns that arise when we talk about human research. So today I'll be providing a brief historical overview of animal experimentation and discussing why we have a whole host of research in biomedical ethics on animal experimentation and animal welfare concerns that developed over the last 30 years. One would think, especially since we've been using animals for research for hundreds of years, that these questions would have come to the forefront well before now. So why do we have this sort of bloom of work on animal welfare and animal ethics? So the lecture today set up as follows. I'll be, as I said, giving a historical overview of animal ethics, and then I will introduce you to one approach that's used to guide animal use today, and that's Peter Singer's ethic. On Wednesday, we'll be looking at two other approaches. There are Tom Regan's theoretical analysis of animal experimentation and Bernie Rollins' work on animal welfare and maintaining animal welfare standards in research contexts. And as you'll see, these three different thinkers have three very different views or guiding principles concerning what animal research should look like today. I always like to think of them as Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and the cold porridge on the one side, hot porridge on the other, and one that may be just right. And I'll leave it up to you guys to determine which ethics go where in that taxonomy. So just to briefly go over ethics to set the stage for Rollins' historical overview of animal research. While not all laws and customs are ethical, ethical principles work at both the individual and social level. So you have social ethics, and social ethics are those views of right and wrong that are encoded in laws and policies. And these are also called social consensus ethics. So we typically come together as a society to determine some basic rules of conduct. And some conduct is seen as good, whereas other conduct is seen as bad. And this is where ethics and law typically come together. So social ethics are those rules of thumb that are found where ethics and law typically overlap. So for example, I'll go back. So for example, we as a society have come to accept basic rules concerning personal property. It is not seen as good behavior, nor is it seen as ethical for me to walk across the street to the house of my neighbor, and I'm looking at it right now, and break into their house and take their television. Like that, both from a legal perspective and from an ethical perspective, is seen as quite bad behavior, in addition to being not good neighborly behavior at all. So a social consensus ethic are these sort of rules of thumb that we follow that are encoded in social mores and in legal statutes. Now, what does this have to do with animal ethics and potential guiding frameworks in animal research contexts? Well, according to Bernie Rollins, animal ethics were historically a hybrid of both individual ethics, and these are ethical standards or rules of thumb that guide individual behavior. What should I personally do? What follows with my character? What follows with my sense of duty and my relationship with others, etc. Those are examples of individual ethical frameworks or individual ethical rules of thumb versus social consensus ethics and the laws and customs that are encoded in our larger social structures. So for Bernie Rollins, he's like, listen, like the reason why we're talking about animal welfare and animal ethics since 1970s post, the reason why we haven't been talking about these prior is because we have both an individual ethic and a social consensus ethic that guides our use of animals. So animal ethics historically were a hybrid of both of these, individual and the social consensus ethic. So I just want to briefly, and that was sort of once again, I jumped ahead and once again, it's spoiler alert. But Rollin provides a historical picture of why we're having this conversation concerning animal use today and why we have 30 plus years of robust discussions on animal ethics, but why these discussions haven't occurred prior. So Rollins argues that we've historically had a social consensus ethic. And he, for quote, for as long as humans have domesticated animals and had a social consensus ethic, it has included an ethic concerning the treatment of animals, end quote. So Bernie's like, listen, there's 2,000 plus years of discussions concerning biomedical ethics and concerning what right behavior looks like in medical contexts, and that often included research contexts as well. And we have all of these codes, but they typically don't discuss animals. Why is this the case? That we've only been discussing research standards and normative standards of, over the last 30 years. And he's like, well, it's because we've already had social and individual ethics in place. So let's look at the social consensus ethic. We know we've had a social consensus ethic in place concerning the treatment of animals because we can look at historical documents. Now, this traditionally included an ethic forbidding cruelty, and it forbade the deliberate, unnecessary infliction of suffering and pain on animals. So Bernie's like, all we need to do is look at documents that were used to guide behavior. So you can turn, for example, to the Bible and other religious texts, and these often condemn animal cruelty, such as mandates such as the following: do not yoke an ox and a mule together, and a sharp knife must be used when slaughtering an animal. In both of these instances, it's a mandate against cruelty. In the case of the ox and the mule, it's because oxen are much larger than mules, so the mule will tire out faster and will suffer throughout the day. A sharp knife to limit pain when slaughtering. All of these are specific mandates against cruelty. He also pointed out that both Aquinas and Kant both condemned animal cruelty because it could lead to the abuse of humans. So here we have these larger social customs and social rules specifically limiting what can and cannot be done to animals and discussing how animals should be treated. In addition, prior to the 1950s, animals were mostly used in farming contexts. And here they lived a symbiotic relationship with humans, whereas if the animals thrived, then the farmer thrived. If your flock became ill, and if your animals obtained diseases and died, then this would be detrimental to putting food on the table and to the prosperity of the farmer. And there was also an individual ethic focused on good husbandry. If the animals thrived, then the farmers thrived. What happens when you place a whole bunch of chickens in a barn, for example, and they're too close together? Prior to antibiotics, the chickens would get sick and most likely die. The very least they would suffer, and they wouldn't produce as many eggs, etc., as you would hope, right? So taking care of your animals, treating them well, was directly connected to personal human thriving. And as such, we have both this social consensus ethic concerning limiting cruelty, and we have an individual ethic built on good husbandry. So we had historically had a minimal social consensus ethic and an individual ethic in place. So what changed? Why are we talking about animal welfare standards today in 2020 when we've had these two perfectly good ethics probably already in place? Why do we need a new ethic, right? Well, Bernie Rollins argues that there were a series of significant social changes that occurred after World War II that made the historical social ethic obsolete. First, and importantly for this class, numbers of animals used in biomedical research increased dramatically post World War II. In the 1900s, the numbers of animals utilized for research purposes numbered in the thousands. Today, the number of animals in research, utilized in research, number in the billions. Right? So there's a marked increase in the amount of animals being used. And there is a change in the reasons why they're being used, right? Rather than going in farming context, now they're being utilized in medical research in large numbers. And in this context, researchers are not being intentionally cruel. They're not breaking the social consensus ethic, right? Because they're motivated by decent intentions, such as to cure disease and ensure product safety, cure cancer, right? Develop develop vaccines, etc., and to advance knowledge. And so one could argue that the mandate against cruelty doesn't hold here. Right? It's not doing any the work that it should do concerning guiding behavior, because research is being done for a wide range of social goods, social and personal goods. Second, when we do focus on agriculture, including animal agriculture, agricultural practices and agricultural systems, etc., due to the technological treadmill, which I will not get in here, but was largely industrialized after World War II. And because of the industrialization of agriculture, we're seeing changes that also undercut the individual ethic. So the industrialization of agriculture greatly increased productivity. The amount of people that individual farmers can feed increased dramatically. But what this meant was that the numbers of farm workers decreased, while the numbers of animals being raised largely increased. So you have a couple of farmers, and you have maybe a concentrated animal feeding operation, for example, let's say pigs. You might have 1,000 hogs in an individual, facility. In the case of chickens, chickens might number in the thousands in a single facility. In addition, animal environments were typically altered to improve productivity. So we see the rise of gestation crates, battery cages, etc. So we have the decrease in workers on the farm. In fact, only about 1% of the American population right now is involved in farming as an occupation, which is incredibly low, especially since prior to World War II, we were looking at over 50%. So we have like a reduction of the number of farmers, but an increase of the animals being raised. And we also have marked changes in how these animals are being raised because of the changes in farms to increase productivity. So behavior, in addition, behavior previously seen as bad husbandry, such as animal overcrowding, it was typically allowed or made possible by pharmaceutical advances and developments with the development of antibiotics and vaccines. Right? So due to these three changes in the agricultural sector and the rise of research contexts, we have both the social consensus ethic breaking down, and in here we have the individual ethic built on good husbandry also breaking down and no longer doing the work that it was supposed to do, at least from a societal perspective. So all of these changes in the way that we raise animals lead to non-intentional animal suffering, right? And to the reduction of negative consequences for previously seen bad husbandry, right? So the individual, as I said, in the social ethic, completely breaking down. So these no longer work in this new environment. In addition, it should be noted that the rise of environmental ethics during the 1970s also brought animal communities and ecosystem thriving into the forefront. So we have these developments in different literature pushing for wider discussions concerning animal welfare. And at least according to Rollin, we have this breakdown of these two ethical components. And that leaves a vacuum, especially during a time where we have so many animals being utilized in research contexts. So I won't show you this video, but I think I will post it on Blackboard so you can see it, because I'm not endorsing Chipotle in any way, shape, or form, but I think this commercial actually encapsulates this idea of a traditional animal husbandry ethic and how that's been sort of undermined by the industrialization of agriculture, and this commercial Chipotle is pushing to sort of revitalize this small-scale farming type thing. Okay, so because of these breakdowns, because these ethics no longer work, Rollin is like, we need a new ethic. And this is why bioethicists have been talking about what animal welfare standards should be in place in research contexts. So, who should be the contender? What new ethic should replace the two historical ethics? Well, I want to show you three potential contenders. Adrian, right? I'm from Philly, so you have to excuse my Rocky references, But we have potential contenders providing us with potential alternatives to these ethics that we can now weigh and argue and discuss about whether or not argue in the good way philosophically about which should replace these historical positions. Peter Singer is like, listen, all we need to do is utilize utilitarianism. Utilitarianism should guide all animal usage in research contexts. And he's like, we apply the principle of utility, do that which produces the greatest benefit for the greatest number, and we are golden. Then we have Reagan, Tom Reagan. He's like, whoa. Peter Singer, but that means that we can use some animals for research. And that's, what about rights? What about the right of the animal to live a flourishing life and do species typical behavior, right? Shouldn't we think about that as well? So Peter Singer is arguing one position. Tom Reagan is pushing back against Peter Singer, arguing that we should actually have a much more limited use of animals in research contexts. And Bernie Rollin is like, whoa, you guys, whoa, utility, I can see its usage, but we should actually think about animal welfare, right? We should ensure that species typical behavior is being recognized, but also standard veterinary care is being provided, and that the environments are conducive towards animal flourishing with enrichment opportunities. But as long as animal welfare standards are in place, we can utilize animals for research. We should adopt the 3 R's though. Right? So we have these three different, very different visions of what animal research should look like today. So for the week, I will be providing an overview of each of these three positions, and Wise's position concerning animal rights and concerning whether or not we should use primates. And we'll be talking about that position on Friday. And I want you to be the judge this week concerning which of these three and potentially others should replace the historical animal ethic. Okay. All right, so I briefly want to go over Singer's ethic, and then we will touch upon this, though, on Wednesday when we talk about Reagan and Rollin as well. So Singer argues that, this is a pretty easy question to answer. Yes, the historical social consensus ethic broke down. The individual ethic no longer works, and there's this vacuum. Well, what should replace these ethics? Well, we already actually have an ethic that was developed in the 1800s. Jeremy Bentham specifically wrote about how we should treat animals. And he argued that consequences should be measured in terms of maximizing pleasures and minimizing pains. We should just apply the principle of utility. Thus, the ethical action would be the one that brings about the most pleasure and the least pain for everyone. And if animals feel pain and pleasure, then they should be included in our calculations about what we should do. Seems like Bentham got this. All we need to do is place animals in the ethical sphere. Right? So Singer adapted this approach. And he's like, if a being can suffer, it has an interest in avoiding suffering. And its interests need to be treated equally to everyone else's interests. Right? So interests for Singer are what matter. If you can feel pleasure and pain, and you have an interest in not feeling pain, and an interest in feeling pleasure, then you should be placed, I wish I had a little arrow to move the animals into the ethical sphere. You should be placed into the ethical sphere. You have ethical importance. And so we need to ensure that your interests are taken into account when we decide what we want to do and what the right action is. So an ethical action for Singer is one that respects all impacted beings' interests, be them human or not. And in fact, if we don't include animals who have interests and who are being impacted by an action in our ethical calculations, then Singer argues we're being speciesist. So speciesism typically includes or involves the assignment of different values, rights, considerations, etc., based solely upon species membership and not upon any ethically robust or important factors, such as whether or not animals are indeed being impacted, and such as whether or not they have an interest in limiting said impacts. So most of this work that we can see with Singer is placing animals in the ethical sphere. So what does this mean? This means that we should do for Singer that action which brings about the greatest good for the greatest number, which would mean for Singer that most research utilizing animals is problematic. However, in cases where research will bring about greatest pleasure for the greatest number, that would be accepted. So Singer argues that animal testing, for the most part, is not justified, but animal testing can be justified provided that there were no other ways to obtain the information, the welfare of the animal is taken into account to limit suffering, and that suffering is outweighed by the long-term benefits that are produced. If the benefits outweigh the harms, then animal experimentation is justified for Singer. Now we have two other positions, as I talked about. Bernie Rollin talks about the 3 pillars of animal welfare, and he also draws upon the 3 R's, and he argues that animal research is justified if welfare standards are in place. And then we have Tom Regan coming in discussing the rights-based approaches, and this is the most limiting of the potential ethics that we can apply. So Singer, we can think of Singer as in the middle. Some animal experimentation is justified, but some isn't. We need to do the calculations to determine which follows the principle of utility. Today I went over the historical picture of why we need a new animal ethic, and we've briefly touched upon the first of 3 potential replacements for this historical approach. And I'm going to leave the story here for today. Wednesday, we'll pick it back up with Regan and Rollin. So if you have any questions or concerns, please let me know. And I am looking forward to the discussion in the discussion board. Thank you, guys.